I'm Rachel Bovard.
I'm Josh Hammer.
I'm Emily Jashinsky.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. You can subscribe now on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. So hi, everyone. We're back for a discussion of a busy week. We're going to be covering today the Equality Act and who's actually funding it. A lot of things going on at the border. There's a border surge in progress. We're going to be talking about that, as well as the January 6th commission, which is bubbling up in Congress. And then finally, the Khashoggi report and how that relates to what we would call a quote unquote principled or unprincipled foreign policy. So to kick us off, I'm going to hand it over to Emily to kick us off on the Equality Act.
Thanks, Rachel. I want to talk about a report that was brought to my attention last week. I shouldn't even call it a report so much as it is a press release on the website of the Human Rights Campaign that essentially brags about the more than 300 major businesses it has gotten to sign on in support of the Equality Act. Now, we have covered the Equality Act on this show in various forms. The perspective on it, of course, is that it's a radical and sweeping piece of legislation that has frightening legal implications. It will normalize the dilution of the essential differences in biology that are so crucial to human relationships on a wide scale. It will destroy women's sports. It will leave women in unsafe situations in domestic violence shelters where they will, and this has happened already, have to sleep next to men who identify as women, even though they've been traumatized by other men in the past, which is why they sought the shelter of a women's shelter. So it's a really bad piece of legislation. It's a really dramatic and radical piece of legislation, but nonetheless, corporate America and big business has signed on to it. And the Human Rights Campaign is one of the most powerful lobbying organizations here in Washington, D.C. They're leftist, and here they are bragging about the open collusion between their powerful lobbying group and big business. If you scroll through the list, which is more than 300 people, Human Rights Campaign actually brags on their website that this group of 300 plus companies represents more than $6 trillion in annual revenue and 13 million employees. So they're essentially saying, look at how big the corporate stick that we're wielding is. And it's not only sort of historically unusual to see from the left, that's sort of the secondary part of this. The big part of this is that big business and corporate interests in this country are colluding with the far left to push a radical cultural agenda on the country. And that's remarkable for a number of reasons, but it speaks to how these major corporations and the media are populated by the kinds of people who are at the Human Rights Campaign. Those people used to really just work at the Human Rights Campaign, but now this educated class of millennials might be sort of neoliberal on fiscal issues, but they are radical on cultural issues. So with that, I'll open up the floor. What did you guys think of this Human Rights Campaign document?
Well, I think what's kind of stunning to me about this whole thing is that all these companies that are coming out for the Equality Act, you've seen even the U.S. Chamber of Commerce come out for the Equality Act, traditionally a bastion of, Republican-leaning members, well, clearly not anymore. They've also come out for diversity mandates on boards. This is obviously, a business interest for these companies. And you have to ask yourself why. Why are they wrapping themselves in the flag of the Equality Act, of woke diversity? And you'd think the left would pick up on this, but it's obviously so nobody notices kind of the fact that they're all still outsourcing, half their manufacturing jobs to slave labor in China, right? The fact that Amazon is infiltrating its employees to prevent them from unionizing. I mean, they're taking clearly anti-worker stances, but because they're supporting the Equality Act, it's okay and no one's going to notice. I mean, you saw this with the Black Lives Matter movement too. All these companies wrap themselves in that flag in an effort to, actually not talk about the real issues that were going on that actually affect people's day-to-day lives. So, this is reputation laundering through the lens of sort of woke politics, and it's always shocking to me that the left continues to fall for it.
It was Antonio Gramsci, one of the great early 20th century, I use the word great loosely here, one of the kind of most famous or infamous early 20th century Marxist figures, the Italian, who famously coined the term the long march through the institutions. I don't know exactly when it happened, but at some point within the past, just like 5 years, maybe, it seems to me like woke capital, like the Fortune 500, has completed its Gramscian march to the institutions. I mean, that's kind of what we're seeing here, right? The Equality Act, I mean, let's be very blunt about this. Emily is not exaggerating here. This is literally one of the most transformational, most radical, frankly, piece of legislation that probably has come before Congress in decades, honestly. And also, just a quick side point before kind of making a more substantive point. By the way, the very fact that the left feels that it has to pass this by legislation kind of undermines the entire legal pinning of Bostock in the first place, that this definition of sex was kind of right there in the statute to begin with. The left would say, oh, it's a difference between Title VII and Title IX. Whatever. No, there's not. It's the same thing. Anyway, the very fact that the people who are drafting this statute, they go so far as to actually expressly put in a provision that prospectively would preclude religious defend, in this case, not plaintiffs, they'd be defending the lawsuits, from invoking RFRA, from invoking the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. There is no way to understand that. To basically say that you, evangelical Christian, you, Jack Phillips, baking the cake, you cannot even invoke RFRA. There is no reason to put that in the statute other than sheer unadulterated malice, which kind of gets me to another point, which is something that we've talked about on this podcast a lot. Rachel, I know you're very passionate about this, is that the left always knows, Democrats know how to actually use political power to make their interests happy, to basically bring home the bacon to their voting blocks, and to actually affirmatively advance, more bluntly, their perverse, amoral or immoral vision of the quote unquote good in legislation. Conservatives, of course, don't do that. At some point back in the 1980s, when this whole notion of the culture war and kind of the first wave of the moral majority kind of came into power, I think conservatives was viewed as like holding the sword, and it was kind of cultural progressives who kind of had the shields. That has just totally changed. I mean, with this Gramscian long march, woke capital, conservatives here are totally on the defensive. Now, it seems to me like the Equality Act is probably not going to pass, thank goodness. But the fact that this could pass through the House in the first place on effectively a party line vote is, I think, pretty harrowing as to where the left is headed. But, it's where they've been. It's kind of just the chickens coming home to roost, I guess.
Yeah, let me just say I concur in the comments of my esteemed panelists here, and will note as well that Jack Phillips has to bake the cake, but all of woke capital can discriminate against conservatives writ large in every single arena. So the hypocrisy is staggering, as is the hypocrisy that Rachel mentioned about how woke capital has no qualms about doing business with places where the rights of their employees are completely abrogated. But of course, here they stand with the quote unquote human rights campaign, which is violating human rights by essentially saying that there is no such thing as sex. I mean, they're watering down science to the point of it being non-existent. And ultimately, of course, there are knock-on effects, as we've alluded to here, with respect to tolerance of those who have traditional faith, with respect to abortion, with respect to obviously the usage of all manner of public accommodations, women's sports, and the list goes on and on. The question we have to ask ourselves, I think there's a political question for a political class, and then for woke capital, which is increasingly converging with the political class. For the politicians, one is, why is it that they continue, particularly on the Democrat side, to cater to fringier and fringier left positions? Is this a bid to continually shift the Overton window to ultimately kind of underpin the principles on which our society is based? Maybe that's a part of it. Are they scared and cowed into it? That may be a part of it. Do they actually believe in what they're peddling? Perhaps some of them do, or maybe it's a combination of all three. And I see something analogous as well with woke capital. I think woke capital is trying to buy absolution for its sins of existing in a marketplace, and for their, I guess in their own view, their ill-gotten gains at some deep psychological level. But you think you can feed the crocodile, but ultimately the crocodile will feed you. You cannot buy absolution from a radical left for whom what constitutes being acceptable is continually shifting to ever more radical places. So there's a question of, are those in the business world true believers? Yes, I'd say a decent percentage of them are, because they've come through the elite institutions that peddle these sorts of ideas. Is it about a simple dollars and cents calculation of thinking that you can essentially buy protection from the left-wing mafia? Yeah, that's probably a part of it as well. Is it cowardice? I assume cowardice is a part of it as well. All of it bodes terribly for the American people when, again, you have concentrated public and private power pushing these policies that ultimately tear at the fabric of our society.
Before we kick it over to immigration, I just want to make one final point, which is that Ben mentioned the concentration of public and private power. Absolutely, with the Equality Act going through the House, and we were at least nervous that it had some sort of chance in the Senate for a little bit, but the private power of that is so powerful on its own, which is that they're saying they're boasting that they represent some 13 million employees in this country. Now, that means that 13 million employees are employed by a company that will probably not tolerate dissent on the topic of gender. And that radically reshapes our cultural norms. That is a powerful, powerful reinforcement of a very changed cultural norm. And you're not going to be that parent that goes to the PTA meeting and says, we can't read this book to 5-year-olds about this other transgender child when your company has signed on to the Equality Act. And there are myriad examples that you can pull like that. But with that, let's open up the floor on immigration.
Sure. So, I think there's a natural segue between these two topics, of course, which is just kind of the intersectional coalition of the left and how intersectionality, identity politics really has become the creme de la creme, the defining feature of what it means to be a progressive, to be a Democrat in the year 2021. Immigration in particular is such a fascinating subject. Michael Lind, who's an essayist who I feel like we bring on this podcast not infrequently, had a fairly lengthy essay at Tablet magazine last week about kind of the winners and losers of immigration. He kind of goes back to the Bracero program in the mid 20th century, talking about how, for decades, for many, many decades, really going up until the Clinton presidency, possibly even slightly later than that, there was a very strong kind of pro-worker, kind of a more protectionist block of the Democratic Party. There always was. If I'm not mistaken, actually, Harry Reid, obviously the longtime Nevada senator, he actually opposed birthright citizenship for illegal aliens as a matter of public policy. He spoke on this in the Senate floor in the 1990s. So it was a very long kind of anti-legal immigration, kind of a more pro-labor protectionist wing of the Democratic Party for a long time. This really started to shift, I think, most dramatically during the Obama administration. That's kind of when the intersectional wing of the Democratic Party kind of emerged as the true defining pinnacle of what it means to be a progressive. And we kind of see that now in what is obviously de facto the third Obama term, which is the Biden administration. We're seeing it already in immigration policy. What's interesting is that during COVID last year, immigration almost kind of went away as a political issue. I actually have a theory that I'd be curious if my co-panelists agree or disagree with this. I actually have a theory this actually kind of hurt President Trump in his re-election campaign, because that obviously kind of was his issue, that kind of his base above all else kind of rallied to. But COVID kind of took immigration off the table entirely. If you look at Customs and Border Protection data, border crossings dipped to historic lows. I mean, last April, I think, shortly after the lockdown started, there were roughly over 17,000 apprehensions at the southwest border. A year before that, in April 19, when there were historic surges, we were talking over 100,000 apprehensions a month. So immigration kind of came off the table. But I wrote a column in December saying that that's this past December 2020, that immigration politics are coming back. And what I was observing, what John Daniel Davidson of the Federalist was observing, is that starting in October, maybe kind of after Trump himself got COVID, as it looked kind of like Biden was perhaps more likely to take this thing, the surges, the apprehensions started to only dramatically increase. We saw caravans, quote unquote caravans that started to form immediately in Honduras and El Salvador and countries like that. And, if I'm just going to briefly kind of read off some of this Customs and Border Protection data right now. Again, if you go back to last year, April 2020, 17,000 border apprehensions. Starting in October and since then, January is the last month for which we have data, January 2021, we're over 70,000 border apprehensions each month. So we are getting further and further up. And what's more than that, Joe Biden tried to put a full pause on all deportations of illegal aliens while the administration kind of undergoes its purported internal reviews of immigration enforcement. But a federal judge in Texas has put a halt on this because guess what? You can't do that because under the Constitution, you have what's called the take care clause, where the executive must take care that the laws are faithfully executed. You can't just unilaterally choose to not enforce the law. But whether it's amnesty, whether it's border apprehensions, the entire agenda here needs to be kind of the return of the open borders agenda, which of course, is an agenda much like the Equality Act agenda that serves the interests of woke capital. It serves the interests of the Fortune 500. It only kind of hurts the working class. It hurts the deplorables. It kind of hurts this new kind of middle America Trumpist coalition, if you will. But it's harrowing stuff, and it's coming back. It really seemed to kind of die down for a while, but we're going to have to find a way as conservatives to push back, even while we're in a political minority here. So happy to kick it over to whoever has thoughts on how we can possibly go about doing that.
Well, I think what's really interesting, to your point about how there used to be a segment on the left that was very interested in this question of immigration as a labor issue. Even at the end of the Obama administration in 2015, if you guys remember, there was this big case out of California, I think it was Southern California Edison, this energy company that laid off a bunch of its native-born workforce and to bring in H-1Bs, to undercut them with cheap foreign labor to do all of their IT jobs. There was bipartisan outrage in Congress. Everybody from Jeff Sessions to Bernie Sanders to Richard Blumenthal, signed a letter basically saying to the company, saying, we need an explanation for how this is happening, wrote the government that was like, this is not how the program is supposed to work, and actually tried to address this issue. Now, it became so partisan to the extent that when President Trump actually put into place and codified regulations that basically said to corporations, you have to stop gaming the H-1B system. It's for highly skilled, labor. It's not for, importing these sort of, mid-level IT jobs from India. The left went crazy, and it's become, very much wrapped up in this mantle of identity politics, to go back to sort of a lot of the Equality Act issues, such that you can't even talk about that anymore. You can't even talk about immigration as a labor issue without being told you're a racist and a bigot. And I think that leaves a huge opportunity for Republicans to take up that very Trumpian mantle to say, no, actually, this is a labor issue. This is about middle-class jobs. This is about Americans being able to compete for jobs in their own country, right? Not that we don't sort of appreciate highly skilled labor, and immigrants coming in on visas, but those aren't the priority. Our American workforce is the priority. But I think, that's one segment of it. I think what you're talking about too, which is the surge at the border, that very much Biden owns that. And that is a story I think we are yet about to see unfold, because that Washington Post article, I think you may have been referencing, where it said there's 70,000 illegal immigrants crossing a month. That's the highest it's been in a decade. People respond to incentives, and Joe Biden has made very clear, he's getting rid of, the Remain in Mexico program, which was, I think, one of the most effective immigration programs we've ever seen at cutting down illegal crossing, which basically said, if you're coming for asylum, that's great. You just have to wait in the country that you claimed it in, which is, Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala. Dismantled that, basically said catch and release is back, all these things. And so, in a national pandemic, when Trump was vilified for what was, a really difficult, grotesque policy in family separation, vilified for that, children in cages or whatever. Well, the cages are being rebuilt, people, and nobody seems to ask any questions about it. I saw someone tweet, well, the big difference between Trump and Biden's cages is that Biden's cages were built by a woman. And I'm like, that's kind of reflective of where we're at. So I don't know if anyone wants to take it from there.
This is infuriating, and that tweet is hilarious. Aaron Blake at the Washington Post wrote an entire essay on how there's a difference between Trump's and Biden's cages, and it all comes down to the fact that Trump is like, he had worse intentions, essentially, which is like, you're just assigning things left and right to people based on your personal opinions of them, and doing it under this sort of like wonkish mantle of, I am just a policy guy. But this is infuriating to me. Like, I moved from Wisconsin. I went to a fancy coastal school, and for all of the blathering that I heard about from the other upper middle class white kids about caring about Black and brown people and about disenfranchised people and about the marginalized communities and about minorities, they have no idea. They will spend hours talking about the term Latinx in this completely masturbatory dorm room conversation, but they have no idea how that is distracting from policies that genuinely hurt workers in this country of all races and nationalities. And they're so untethered from the reality of the working class right now because they've all filtered through our academic system, our system of higher education that is untethered from the realities of the working class. And so they now go and control our politics and our corporate institutions and our entertainment institutions. And our culture as a whole has this we're just massively distracted from the rest of the country because our pop culture and our politics are totally divorced from the reality of it. And it's sad, it's infuriating, and it's hard to sort of imagine how we can get back from it. I like Rachel's optimistic take that it creates a huge opportunity for Republicans. This is obviously the vacuum that Donald Trump stepped into. And you can, any politician could do the same thing, whether they're a Republican or a Democrat. Like a Bernie Sanders that had not wandered from his initial sort of pro-worker, anti-illegal immigration take would have been a much stronger Bernie Sanders than the Bernie Sanders we actually ended up seeing. So this is opportunity for someone, but at the same time, it all is sort of rooted in everybody's inability to have honest conversations. I mean, if you talk about it, you're a bigot. And if you talk about it in the wrong way, you're a bigot. So yeah, that's the central issue to kind of get around. And I'm not optimistic that we have people who are strong enough to do that. I mean, you can even look at somebody, love him or hate him, as principled as Bernie Sanders, who had to start talking about Russian collusion. So it's not a great situation.
I think first observation is it says everything you need to know about where the Democrat establishment and probably the Republican establishment is as well, that merely by dint of Joe Biden getting elected, immediately the immigration caravan reconvened and started up again, and you're already seeing the numbers explode. That just tells you everything you need to know about how the rest of the world perceives where we are as a country and where the Democrat half of the country and much of the Republican establishment as well is, and also the lack of respect for our borders, our sovereignty, our rule of law. I think the simple response to the notion of you're a bigot if you are against open borders in perpetuity is you're a bigot if you seek to punish American people of all colors, races, creeds, socioeconomic background, pick your cut of demographics, if you believe in punishing them and privileging above them non-citizens whose first act in this country is to break our laws and show total disrespect for Americans, leaving aside the obvious societal consequences, the costs, real and intangible, the crime and beyond, even the non-negative things. And we're not even talking about, by the way, one thing that the Biden administration did when it went and revoked a slew of Trump administration policies. And I have a piece coming at the American Mind about this shortly. One of the things the Biden administration did, little noticed, was it undid Trump administration policy to, first of all, try to get a count of illegal aliens and non-citizens in the country more broadly, and then to remove that population, at least the illegal alien part of it, from the census count. Why is that important? Well, as of today, everyone who is here, if you're a non-citizen and if you're an illegal alien, you are counted in that census. As a consequence of that, apportionment for this country is determined. So how the congressional seats are cut, how districts are cut, who gets representation. As a consequence of, and also, by the way, how hundreds of billions of dollars every year are doled out and allocated publicly. As a consequence of that, there is real foreign interference in our elections, and that is merely by dint of there being such a mass of tens of millions, potentially, of non-citizens here who are counted in the census. That does have a real political consequence. It disenfranchises and dilutes the vote of some voters, and it privileges other voters above them because, again, the population count is driven by those including non-citizens and among them including illegal aliens. So, you don't need to be a conspiracy theorist and claim this is the Cloward-Piven model of trying to overrun the system, but merely as a consequence of not controlling our borders, forgetting whether there's amnesty or not. Already there is a substantial political consequence in terms of the value of your vote to illegal immigration. And I think that alone is something that really ought to be hammered home and Democrats ought to answer for.
Yeah, so that's terrific stuff from Ben. Frankly, the census point in voting and voter dilution, all of that is probably one of the most under-discussed aspects, actually, of our illegal immigration problem. I just want to emphasize, something kind of that plays off of what Rachel said about people responding to incentives. I come back often to an op-ed that Rachel's boss, actually, Jim DeMint, wrote back in 2014 for Politico. I think it was entitled The Injustice of Amnesty. This is kind of back during the first UAC wave, the first kind of wave of unaccompanied alien children arriving at our border back in the summer of 2014. So, and this is kind of a point that's only gotten more and more obvious over time. Rachel's actually written a ton about this, actually. It's with the coyotes and the traffickers and the cartels, all the horrible, horrible injustices and crimes that happen to the people who are smuggled, who are trafficked, for women in particular. All the rapes, there are legitimately a shockingly, I don't have the data in front of me, but a shockingly high number of rapes on these caravans. But, this is fundamentally unjust. And just to make one kind of final point before kicking it over to Rachel to kind of talk about this January 6th commission, not to sound so stereotypical here, but just, this is the Edmund Burke Foundation. We're home for national conservatism. Just to kind of reiterate one of Trump's punchlines, which is just so obvious and so self-evident that almost doesn't have to be said. If you don't have borders, you don't have a country. That is just astoundingly obvious. And the fact that it's not obvious just shows the dire depths that I think we're in. But on that somewhat pessimistic note, I'm happy to kick it over to Rachel to talk about that most optimistic of topics, January 6th.
Yeah, the one last thing I'll say before I move to that is the point that you're making about the incredible incentives to sex traffic women, the horrific conditions that women live in as a result of our immigration laws. It's horrific to me that Democrats who are about to impeach Andrew Cuomo for sexual harassment somehow cannot get their minds around how badly women are treated. I remember when Trump made this point that, women give or daughters, they give their daughters birth control on their way up to the border because they know they're going to be raped. And Trump said this, and Jamal Hill tweeted out, "If you believe this, you're stupid and a liar," or something to that effect. When in fact, Doctors Without Borders reports on this happening. Reports on the horrific abuse suffered by women and girls at the hands of coyotes and men on their way to the borders because our laws incentivize this. So the fact that Democrats refuse to even have this discussion, I think speaks volumes to their motives. But speaking of their motives, moving to the January 6th commission. So obviously in the wake of everything that happened in January 6th, there is a push on Capitol Hill to have a commission to investigate this, primarily pushed by Nancy Pelosi, but seems to be somewhat unavoidable at this point. Like, this commission is now going to happen, supposedly modeled on the 9/11 commission, but doesn't seem to be shaping up that way right now, because if you remember, the 9/11 commission was actually quite a somber affair. It had some members of Congress, but it was evenly split between affiliations of Republicans and Democrats, very much an expert panel. This seems to be a panel made up of exclusively members. Democrats want a majority. They want to treat it like a normal committee in the Congress when it is clearly not that. Republicans are obviously pushing for a partisan equality here. But I think that, there's a couple things I want to say about it. The first is this. I do think what does need to be investigated about what happened is what the heck was going on with Capitol Police. How this was allowed to happen in the first place, I think, is self-evident question number one. Protesters never should have gotten this close. If they were let in, if the door was opened for them, can you really call it like a breach of the Capitol if they were welcomed in? What were the protocols? What warning signs were ignored? All of that I do think deserves investigation. But the second issue is this. If we are going to go down this path, I think Democrats are using this commission like they've used everything else about what happened on January 6th, which is an opportunistic motive or opportunity to, punish their political rivals in ways that, will now be entrenched political power that the Republicans will never be able to take back because they want to pin everything that happened on January 6th onto Republicans. I mean, you've seen the comments of Jerry Connolly, who's a Republican from Northern Virginia, that is effectively saying Republicans are terrorists. Anyone who has not, denounced anything that happened is a domestic terrorist. So we're dealing with that kind of binary framing. So I think the question is, and it's something that Arthur Bloom at the American Conservative, I think, very ably laid out in a piece published this morning that says essentially, look, if Republicans are going to participate in this, then the ball is in their court. They should have subpoena authority and they should use it. Because was this actually, what kind of event was this? Can you actually call this an insurrection if everybody's phones were tracked? Bank of America willingly handed over every credit card detail and transaction, for the people who were there. What kind of surveillance was around this? Is this actually a threat, or is it one that can be unpacked as simply a handful of people, or a couple hundred people in a crowd of thousands, doing a very bad thing? It kind of goes to this point. There was a Suffolk University poll that came out a couple of days ago, which asked Republicans, 1,000 Republicans, their opinions on QAnon. And if you've watched any of the mainstream media coverage or talked to a single Democrat, you would think that our party is, well, speaking for myself, the party I'm affiliated with, is one giant email forward of conspiracy theories. Like, that's our entire party. But based on this poll, the majority of people didn't even know what QAnon was, and it got a 4% approval rating among Republicans. So if this is the case, right, this is incumbent upon Republicans to use their oversight power on this committee to prove the narrative false and to remove the specter of, all Republicans are domestic terrorists from, the middle class Republicans, who are the ones that are going to suffer the most from this, right? Rule of law doesn't apply to the elites here. Rule of law applies to the middle class who gets fleeced, by these Democrats trying to conflate what happened on January 6th with every living and breathing Republican in America. So I'll open it up there for anyone to comment on, I think, opportunities here or the threat thereof.
Ben, do you want to start us off here? I mean, you've written kind of prolifically on kind of the domestic war and terrorism that's kind of closely tied into this.
Yeah, I'm just sitting here stewing in my chair. I think about a week after the Capitol riots, I wrote in the Federalist that this was going to be used as an accelerant in the coming purge on wrong thinkers, on anyone who dissents from the ruling class, and that the ruling class would take all of the wrong lessons from the Capitol riot, which, by the way, is that there were, by some reports, up to 500,000 people there. A percentage stormed the Capitol. Why there was no defense there is a question that ought to be answered. And it seems like the president did say you should have 10,000 National Guardsmen, he claimed. And it also seems that it may have been Speaker Pelosi, according to some accounts, that may have effectively called for the stand down, so that better be investigated. But first of all, every single fact that was originally reported that was considered salient about this has essentially fallen apart in the weeks since. And so this is another example of the media and the political class, like with Russiagate, I would say again, and it's not to say that what happened at the Capitol didn't happen. It absolutely did happen, and it was shameful and deplorable. But look, the first thing is Officer Sicknick was killed with a fire extinguisher. It appears that's not the case now. Of the 5 people who perished that day, the only one of them who it appears really died as a consequence of the confrontation that occurred was Ashley Babbitt, one of the people storming the Capitol. So that's the first thing. Those facts have been completely glossed over. The New York Times issues a quote unquote retraction, weeks after the fact, even though this is sort of the central pillar in their argument of 5 people died at the seat of democracy in America. Then there are the arguments about the fact that people were armed and some people had ties, as if they were going to assault and carry away members of the House. Those arguments as well have fallen apart. It appears that of the maybe 200 cases or so that are being brought, according to people who have looked in to the indictments, the allegations are that essentially no one was really armed at the Capitol with heavy weaponry on that day on the Capitol grounds. So again, all of the basic facts that are supposed to form this narrative about what transpired, that this is somehow equivalent to 9/11, also leaving aside the fact that the New York Times itself showed that basically there was minimal property damage at the end of this attack on democracy, where suddenly, the speaker was going to be deposed and worse. It's all fallen apart. Again, it is not to say that what happened at the Capitol wasn't shameless, but it is to say that they had to gin up a hysteria and a fervor around this so that they could feed this information operation ongoing that, by the way, started in the Obama years about trying to say that domestic extremism, in particular far-right extremism, white supremacism, however they define it, which is going to be conservatives, essentially. It's going to be, if you have Edmund Burke on your bookshelf, or as I think I've said before, Thomas Sowell, or anyone else, you are going to be dragged away. Or, as you'll see, they use the full force of the federal government against anyone who is implicated in this, and private industry. Whereas, of course, during the Capitol riots, where there was exponentially more property damage and death and destruction, the government did not use the same level of powers, not even close. So I view this all as part of one rolling information operation to justify the coming purge on wrong thinkers, which is already accelerating. And by the way, as in the first segment, private corporations, putatively private corporations, are all on board with this as well. So once again, all of these forces, the powerful commanding heights of society, are glomming onto a narrative in order to try to rout conservatives. And so at a very minimum, what Republicans have a duty to ask is, first of all, how do you justify this coming domestic war on violent extremism if this event has fallen apart and you can't cite other events that justify it? How are you going to protect the civil liberties of Americans in their political beliefs, which is exactly one of the central things that government exists to protect: freedom of speech, freedom of thought, and to protect robust political advocacy? On what basis and what powers are you going to use to justify this coming purge using the full force of the federal government on Americans? So very basic questions ought to be asked, and there ought to be real drilling down on the purported facts that have been used as the basis for trying to turn this Capitol riot into, in the words of representatives themselves, a 9/11 or a Pearl Harbor, when the facts simply do not meet those standards of those tragedies.
Well, I think that's my question, though, about this, is that I think that rests on efforts of Republicans to take this that mission seriously, to sort of quell the moral panic that is going to be used to silence a lot of conservatives, a lot of Republicans. And that's the question, I think, that is yet unanswered, because I think the impulse of Republicans initially is to say this is not legitimate, and why aren't we investigating the Black Lives Matter protests? Both of those things I understand those responses, but I guess they have the opportunity to use the levers of government and the subpoena power and the oversight that they will have on this commission to get to the bottom of this. It's a question to me of whether they'll use it. So Emily or Josh, I don't know, if you think they even should.
That's kind of a good segue into my takeaway of all of this, which is that our government is utterly broken. Because if you sort of go back to the description as Rachel laid it out, which was super helpful, it's incredible how we can't even perform the basic functions that we're supposed to in this country. I mean, I'm fully on board with the notion of a commission, because there were serious breakdowns in security and we should know where that happened. This was incredibly embarrassing. You don't need to exploit this, as the corporate media has done, and to play it up for it to be an embarrassment for our country and for it to reflect really poorly. But why were people at the Capitol, and why were people so motivated to do what they did? And Ben is right. It was a small chunk of a larger chunk. But it all stems back to distrust in our voting. And I think a lot of Republicans went too far in the way that they talked about the issues in the voting system since the election. Absolutely. I think the president went way too far. But why is it that people don't even trust the most basic function of the republic? Why is it that people are so deeply distrustful? Is it because Republicans are feeding them reasons to be distrustful, or is it because there are legitimate reasons to be distrustful? And it always goes back to that. And so now that there is this binary, as Rachel mentioned, that prevents Democrats from working with any Republicans. There's a quote actually from a Democratic member of Congress that came out last week that said, "I am specifically not working with any Republican who signed on to support the lawsuits or voted to support the lawsuits in Pennsylvania, Arizona." I forget exactly the details of it, but they said that was their litmus test. So when you have that binary, the government literally cannot function. And you can take it, it's voting, it's vaccine rollout. There's so many different elements of this. And it's not because a single Republican endorsed or motivated or wanted people to storm the Capitol of the United States. Not a single Republican member of Congress wanted that to happen, endorsed it, excused it, justified it. It's because people, and whether it's a small percentage or in different varying degrees with a larger percentage, but there's deep distrust with our institutions. And it's not the fault of people who distrust our institutions. It's essentially the fault of our institutions. It's not an excuse for what happened. The rioters, it was disgusting. I was there covering it and had to leave because I was so disgusted with watching what was happening to our city and to our Capitol. But we have to sort of turn the lens to the institutions and stop sort of allowing those divisions to prevent us from actually solving the problems. But that's exactly where we are.
Yeah, I mean, we could probably do a whole podcast on kind of institutional breakdown in America and Americans kind of terribly falling, de-escalating trust in institutions more broadly. Yuval Levin of AEI National Affairs has written a whole book on this and is dedicating a lot of his current work to this exact issue. Look, I don't oppose a commission necessarily in principle. I thought Henry Olson of Ethics and Public Policy Center and Washington Post wrote at least a somewhat persuasive column. I am deeply skeptical of how it would look in practice. I think for a lot of the reasons that Ben is talking about here. We obviously can't slap Susan Collins and Mitt Romney on this commission and call it a bipartisan commission, right? I mean, we have to make sure that some sort of actual, genuinely conservative, slightly more pro-Trump kind of perspective is also represented there. But, you know, this is going to be a perfect segue into our final segment here. But I'm deeply sympathetic to Ben's point about how this whole thing has taken on life its own as an information operations, you know, an exercise in what our friend Dave Riaboy would call information warfare. And it kind of brings me back to, and I'm a lawyer, I think about words and all that stuff. The left is so much better at words than the right is. It's kind of an elementary point. I think all the way back to the Supreme Court oral argument for the Shelby County versus Holder case in the 2013 Supreme Court term. Just a little refresher, that was the voting rights case where the court 5-4 majority ends up kind of invalidating the quote unquote Section 4 cover formula. And I remember an oral argument, Justice Scalia, may he rest in peace, said to kind of the Obama DOJ's lawyer, he basically said, who in Congress would vote against the Voting Rights Act? It's called the Voting Rights Act because they're so good at just labeling everything. And the fact that they've gotten away with labeling this an insurrection, you know, these words have meanings. Like the word insurrection has like 100,000-year history, a pedigree with like an actual like legal meaning to it. This were an insurrection, there would have been U.S. Marines going into there, for God's sake. This was not an insurrection. But anyway, one thing that it definitely is it's taken on life of its own as information operations. It's going to be weaponized. It will be wielded as a cudgel to suppress many people who have broadly kind of right-leaning, not particularly quote-unquote extreme or radical viewpoints. I hope the commission does exactly what Rachel wants it to do. I'm just a little skeptical that it will. But, you know, on the information operations point, Ben, why don't you tell us a little bit about what's going on with the kind of information operations story of the year, which is l'affaire Jamal Khashoggi.
Yeah, and I wrote about this contemporaneously in saying that this was about reconvening or developing the joint Iran deal Muslim Brotherhood echo chamber in that case back in 2018 when the grisly murder of Jamal Khashoggi in Turkey at the hands of the Saudi authorities occurred in a bid to undermine the Trump administration's policy, which of course was rooted in developing a condominium, a partnership of sorts between relatively secular, authoritarian Sunni Arab regimes, Israel, and the U.S. as a bulwark against the perceived greatest threat in the region and the actual greatest threat in the region, in my view and in the view of the administration, in Iran, its proxies, and also as well their Sunni Islamist partners. This brings us to today and the Biden administration, which has stated a desire to recalibrate its relationship with Saudi Arabia and turn away from Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who spearheaded this effort to develop this nascent partnership between other Arab nations and Israel and the US. The Biden administration has sought to reverse that. Part of their effort to reverse it, they claim, is holding the Saudi regime to account for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. It's important to first emphasize who was Jamal Khashoggi. The way that he was portrayed then and today is that he was this freedom-fighting, democracy-seeking critic of the Saudi regime in exile who was brutally murdered. He was a dissident, he was a muckraker, etc. David Ignatius wrote about him, his former colleague at the Washington Post wrote about him in glowing terms as a beloved figure in the foreign policy community. When you actually look at Jamal Khashoggi's background, that narrative starts to fall apart. And I raise this not to de-emphasize how horrible his murder was, but to say that the circumstances around it matter to the extent there are going to be policy consequences to it. And it also undermines the outrage out there in our political class and furor over his death. So who was Jamal Khashoggi in reality? He was a former mouthpiece of senior Saudi intelligence officials and other government figures who led Saudi publications that, of course, only operated at the behest of the Saudi government. He mourned the death of Osama bin Laden. He was a Muslim Brotherhood supporter for the vast majority of his career. He has a slew of anti-Semitic tweets that you can find out there about him. So this was not the choir boy that he was portrayed to be. And maybe most importantly of all, apparently the storylines that he was pursuing at the Washington Post were in large part fed to him, or at least crafted, by Qatari-linked organizations. So one way to think of Khashoggi is as a political operative who was caught in a dangerous geopolitical game between the competing parts of the House of Saud, Turkey, where he was assassinated, and Qatar. And that provides a much more a critical context because it shows the disingenuousness of those who are feigning outrage over his death back in 2018 and today, which is, first of all, that they completely skate over the truth about his background or the full story of his background. And second of all, that they shed tears for Khashoggi when there are scores of people from China to Turkey to Iran who really fit the idealized profile of Khashoggi in terms of freedom fighting journalists out there who end up getting kidnapped or taken away to prisons and ultimately assassinated or at a minimum tortured and worse. And the political class is silent on it. And all of that points to the fact that this release of a Khashoggi report, which is about really 1.5 pages of text in effect, stating that on the basis of essentially open source information that we've known for months now, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman likely directed the assassination, does not tell us anything new. So why is it being raised now, this weak assessment in February of 2021? Well, as I mentioned, the Biden administration wants to do two things. It wants to recalibrate the relationship with Saudi Arabia away from what the Trump administration was seeking to achieve. And it also seeks to go back to the table with Iran, which Saudi Arabia is the key Sunni Arab bulwark against and foe of, and seeks to reward Iranian aggression with respect to removing the terror designation from Houthis or freezing arms sales to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And of course, going back to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA-Iran deal, with no preconditions and withdrawing the snapback sanctions that have been placed on Iran, all of which is to say that Khashoggi himself is part of an information operation, and he was an operative himself. His death is being used to try to justify this turn away from the Trump administration policy, which sought to extricate the U.S. from the Middle East by building up a bulwark of Sunni Arab and Israeli states, which should be broadly agreed on, I think, by most of the American public as a positive thing to get the U.S. footprint reduced there, and instead turning towards an adversary that chants death to America and death to our partner and ally Israel and our Sunni Arab partners and allies as well. So the question for all of this is, what does this all portend to America's national interest when you have a situation where we're trying to completely turn a 180 over a policy that seemed to create at least relative stability in a region that we've been mired for far too long?
So I think Ben lays out the history very well here. I mean, Jamal Khashoggi's whole quote unquote career as a Washington Post quote unquote columnist was that of an information operative. I mean, this is someone who grew up closely connected to the House of Saud, who kind of soured on this Saudi regime as it became increasingly clear that Saudi Arabia would crack down on Islamism, would crack down on the radical Sunni clerics. And then he kind of got cozy with the Qatari regime, which, you know, to this day, along with Erdogan's Turkey, is one of the great exporters of Sunni Islamism and global jihad. And his gig at the Washington Post was effectively funded by the Qatar Foundation. In fact, you know, someone correct me if I'm wrong here. I don't think Jamal Khashoggi I think he barely spoke a word of English. I mean, like, I don't even think he actually wrote those quote unquote columns to which he was attributed. So his entire career was that of an information operative. Now, no one is justifying or excusing what, by all indications, was a gruesome murder in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. He did not deserve to die for his beliefs, no matter how horrendous they were. He literally mourned Osama bin Laden. He called for the annihilation of Israel, loved Hamas, but he didn't deserve to necessarily die for those beliefs. No one is saying that. What we are saying here is that it would be deeply imprudent and counterproductive to try to use this as an excuse to reorient ourselves away from Saudi Arabia, to the extent that Saudi Arabia is the linchpin of a kind of Western-aligned Sunni alliance of states that is very necessary for countering Iranian hegemony. That is really kind of the extent of all we're saying here. You know, President Trump, you know, we all kind of remember that famous image of him with the orb, right? It's kind of, it had a ton of different memes on Twitter. That was his first overseas trip, and that was in Riyadh. That was in Saudi Arabia. So this was kind of, that was Trump's, it was very symbolic. It was his very first trip overseas. He was going to take us, you know, he eventually pulled out the Iran deal. He was going to pull us back to our traditional allies. He was going to get us back into the game of actually rewarding our allies and punishing our enemies, in contradistinction to capital D Democratic Party foreign policy of punishing our allies and rewarding our enemies. And kind of cozying up to the Saudi regime. You know, Jared Kushner and Mohammed bin Salman were famously chummy. They used to chat on WhatsApp all the time. This was a huge part of that. So, you know, look, the Middle East is a rough spot, okay? And, you know, people from both parties, whether it was the Bush administration or the Obama administration, have tended to look at this with rose-colored glasses. Obviously, the Bush administration, you had this kind of moralistic, neoconservative, democracy-spreading agenda. The Obama administration wanted to spread democracy in a different way by supporting the so-called Arab Spring, the Muslim Brotherhood, you know, purported democratic uprising. So, you know, internationalists of both parties, globalists, I guess you would say, have supported kind of a more democratizing agenda. I think it's incumbent, though, upon especially nationalism or nationalist-oriented conservatives to kind of adopt a much more hard-headed, realist approach to foreign policy in general, especially in the Middle East, where our options are not between kind of Madisonian democracy on the one hand and Islamism on the other hand. No, our choices are these kind of more authoritarian and admittedly non-ideal regimes. Saudi Arabia obviously just allowed women to drive for the first time within the past year or two. These are not exactly liberal democracies, but our choice is between Western-aligned authoritarian regimes and tremendously counterproductive, destabilizing exporters of Islamism, the likes of which is the Iranian regime. That is our choice. The Biden administration shows every indication of making the wrong choice, I think.
I think this is also, though, reflective of like the 2005 playbook being applied to like 2021. And what I mean by this is, the Trump administration, I think, took very good steps to shore up our position in the Middle East, against Iran, the hegemonic power of Iran. Okay, done. The biggest threat, in my mind, continues to be from China. And there's just sort of a complete just ignorance of this fact, right? Like, we're talking about Jamal Khashoggi and we're lionizing Jamal Khashoggi. Has Joe Biden called what's happening to the Uyghurs a genocide? Like, is that even being acknowledged? Because his Secretary of State has, but I think Joe Biden most recently called it like a different norm. Well, the Uyghurs are being enslaved and there's credible reports of the rape and forced sterilization of women. So I think that, again, it's just grandstanding on a point that I just don't think, to everything that Ben and Josh have just said, is productive in any fashion or form. Well, Trump, I think, has dealt with the Middle East in a productive fashion, and the growing actual threat economically and geopolitically of China remains sort of unaddressed. And, we're not even discussing it. The Biden administration isn't even discussing it. So I just think this like obsessive focus on doing what Trump did in the Middle East is going to not serve us well. By the way, we haven't even talked about the fact that we bombed Syria. No. So like,
let me just jump in and make one point before we turn to Emily, which is on that point about China. Part of the reason that the Trump administration sought to extricate America from the Middle East was to turn resources to more important pressing priorities, which was China. By contrast, the Biden administration has sent Rob Malley, its Iran envoy, who will be one of the people leading the talks to return to the JCPOA, sent him to have conversations with Chinese officials regarding Iran deal. So I would argue that part of this is about the fact that China is viewed as a partner, just like, by the way, the Obama administration viewed Russia as a partner and lauded it for helping shepherd through the Iran deal in the first place. With that, I'll turn to Emily.
I'm not a foreign policy person, and I don't have a ton to add on this topic, but I will say that I remember the week of Khashoggi's killing. I was scheduled to go on TV and talk about it. So as a non-foreign policy person, I consulted someone who knows more about these issues than myself. And I was at a movie and they called me and I left the movie. It was a Saturday night and I was on the phone with them and they were telling me, like, listen, the corporate press right now is lionizing Khashoggi as a journalist and is framing this as the death of, as an attack on a member of the Fourth Estate. And that is not the whole story. And you should not go and parrot those lines because they are not accurate. And when you're sort of in that frenzy, the media frenzy, where all of the competing narratives are sort of cementing into the one corporate press narrative, that's not an easy thing to do because, of course, it was a horrible killing, and nobody wants journalists to be killed, and nobody wants to work with countries that are having journalists executed. Absolutely not. But the sort of if it bleeds, it leads line was really driving the press's coverage. This was a grisly murder. It was a crime. There was a lot for them to talk about. It just was so interesting to me. On that phone call, I can still picture it in the hallway of the movie theater, thinking, could they really be framing something that inaccurately? And if they are, they have to be doing it on purpose. They know the other details. They know that. And I was so grateful for that conversation, because as time has gone on and the dust has settled, it is remarkable how different that early narrative about what happened to Jamal Khashoggi is from reality. And it's such a good illustration. It's one of the best illustrations that I've experienced in my career of how important it is to question literally every narrative that comes out of the corporate media, even when something seems so cut and dry and so obvious. That's sort of like, to me, and now the reason they frame it is because they have their own priorities, right? Like they have priorities relating to Saudi Arabia and Iran, and now they are using the framing once again to push their own foreign policy agenda. It's not like grand conspiratorial QAnon stuff. It's out in the open for you to see. I mean, we know that they're saying things that are out of touch with reality, and we know that they're doing it to advance their foreign policy agenda. But that's sort of like what's remarkable to me, is just how completely different the narrative is from reality, and how easy it is to sort of get swept up in it.
Let me tie a quick bow on it, which is that 1, Jamal Khashoggi should not have been murdered. 2, it is a classic use of tradecraft for foreign entities to use mouthpieces as journalists to further their agendas. 3, we should not be reorienting our entire Middle East policy on the basis of what happened to Jamal Khashoggi. And 4, everyone should read Jeane Kirkpatrick's Dictatorships and Double Standards, because it explains why.
So on that note, I think we'll take it around the room for some final thoughts. To lay mine out there, it strikes me that all the things that we're talking about are existing under this umbrella of a Politico report that, there's no public schedules published for the Biden administration. Biden himself has not had a public briefing in the 5 weeks since he took office. There's no visitor logs that are being published. And this is not a very transparent administration. Meanwhile, all of these things are happening. We have military intervention into Syria, 70,000 border crossers a month, the Equality Act, the January 6th Commission, major moves in foreign policy in the Middle East. And the person elected to handle all this has not had a public briefing in 5 weeks. So I will just let that linger with you all.
Sorry, Rich. I was going to say, something that strikes out to me, just all the topics that we're covering here, there is such a visceral hatred of Donald Trump and the Trump administration, and there is such a genuine seething hatred probably of the right of center in America in general, that, whether it's immigration, whether it's this foreign policy in the Middle East, kind of like, going back to the Middle East away from kind of the pivot to Asia, all this stuff, so much of it seems to me to be so cynically motivated by kind of a raw desire to just overturn everything that Trump did, simply for the very simplistic reason that Trump did it. Orange man bad, he did it, therefore we need to overturn it. The Equality Act, there's certainly some kind of intellectual similar themes that are going on there, although notwithstanding, this is kind of a longstanding desire of them to try to get this off the ground. We need to kind of get more comfortable. I feel like I'm being a dead horse at this point, but we need to kind of, as conservatives, get more comfortable with soberly recognizing the left for who they actually are. They are unafraid to nakedly, openly, out in the open, do what they think is best to save the country according to their dystopian, perverse vision. And unless and until conservatives wake up to that reality and start kind of imbibing that and starting to kind of formulate earnest policies to counter that genuinely, I think we're in trouble. But I do think the tools are there. We just need to actually start doing it.
My final thought is going back to the Equality Act conversation. One thing I wanted to mention, but it's really what grinds my gears the most about it, is that the effect of the Equality Act, where you're reinforcing, and even the immense support from corporate America, where they're bragging about having 13 million employees and $6 trillion of revenue under the banner of the Equality Act. It's just this, what it does is reinforces norms that hurt the working class and hurt the middle class. And it is infuriating to me that the left purports to be speaking for the working class and for working people in this country when they have that, when they advance that agenda, because what that does is this, actually, honestly, the central thing that the Equality Act does, apart from its implications for gender, is it disempowers the it disempowers disenfranchised people to speak because their corporations support this radical elite leftist agenda. And so their power to speak and defend their family, to defend their children from noxious ideas about sex and gender that are utterly false and contradict, in a lot of cases, their faith, to defend their employment, to get that paycheck while also staying true to their beliefs and to their faith and to the essentialism of biology. It takes power away from them to do that. And for the party that claims to be, the party of Bernie Sanders and the party of Kamala Harris and Joe Biden that claims to be defending the working class and speaking for the working class, this is a disgusting piece of legislation, and they have no idea how this actually affects people who defend on their paychecks and are, Christian or people of faith. It's just really gross to see them do this.
Just to second Josh's point, as we seem to arrive at pretty much every single week, we are under assault in every single arena. And until and unless the left sees that there are consequences to it, that they are met with an equal and opposite reaction, they will continue to act with impunity. So to second Josh's point, the task for conservatives is to exact those costs on the left so that they are forced to recoil and get into a crouching defensive position instead of being constantly on offense, while at the same time maintaining our values and principles. And that is the charge to us, is not to stoop to their level while meeting them with the same level of force with which they are attacking us and showing that there are consequences to it. I also want to second one point that Emily made before that's a critical one that I didn't get to, which is that part of the focus on the Capitol riot is about turning our attention away from what happened in the 2020 election. The purpose is to make that completely verboten, to never get an actual accounting as to what transpired and ultimately what the policy remedies need to be to ensure that the irregularity, the fraud, and the corruption that occurred during that election, as documented in any number of suits which were mainly rejected on process grounds, are remedied. To that point, the Supreme Court refused to take on, among other 2020 election-related cases, the two Pennsylvania cases, which were about something as basic as who makes election rules. As laid out in our Constitution, it's pretty clear that it's state legislatures, but Pennsylvania and several other states as well determined that judges ought to make decisions about the rules and regulations governing elections on emergency grounds. That the Supreme Court refused to take those cases is a guaranteed recipe for disaster. It shows how bankrupted our political institutions are, that they refuse to answer a question as basic as that, not even grappling with all the fraud, irregularity, and corruption that I mentioned, but just, is it lawful for judges to essentially make law? The fact that the Supreme Court and only 3 members of the Supreme Court dissented, I think tells you all you need to know about the fact that conservative judges, purported conservative judges, are no panacea. The judicial branch of government is no panacea, and we have our work cut out for us when it comes to elections, because that is really where the rubber meets the road. And as we've talked about before, H.R. 1, that first bill out of the House, threatens to enshrine all of the corruption that occurred in 2020, make it law, which will make us a permanent minority in this country. So on that sunny note, I'll turn it back to our leader today.
Well, thanks, everybody. And on behalf of Ben, Emily, Josh, thanks for joining us. I'm Rachel Bovard, and we'll see you next time on NatCon Squad.